Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the StarQuest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit givemysterious.fm. You're listening to episode 408 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the Book of Revelation. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today, as always, is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Now, folks, be sure to stay around for the end of the episode, as we'll have your feedback on our recent episode on how many souls do twins have, and more weird questions. But first, the most controversial book in the entire Bible is undoubtedly the Book of Revelation. Many people confess that they simply don't know what it means, and some commentators, like Protestant reformer John Calvin, refuse to write a commentary on it. But other people are convinced that they know exactly what it means. They spin detailed scenarios about it and make confident proclamations. But others vigorously disagree. So, what theories have been developed about the Book of Revelation? What clues do we have about them? And can we figure out what the book means? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. And so, Jimmy, we've discussed Revelation before on the show, haven't we?
Well, we've discussed aspects of it. For example, in episode 138, we talked about the mark of the beast being a figure who is mentioned starting in Revelation chapter 13. Also, in episode 357, we discussed the rapture, which many people link to the book. You can check out that episode if you'd like to know what I think about the rapture. In that episode, I also promised that we'd come back and do at least one episode looking at the Book of Revelation itself, so that's what we'll be doing today.
The Book of Revelation contains a lot of different symbols. Will you be telling us what each of one of them means today?
Definitely not. It would take tens or even hundreds of hours to go through them all and argue what they each mean. Today we're going to be taking a top-level view only, and we'll be looking at the broad major interpretations that have been offered for the book. We'll be focusing primarily on figuring out how the book relates to history, to the past, the present, and the future. We may come back in future episodes and talk about individual symbols in it, especially the major ones, but today our goal is to just sketch the major theories about what the book means, and then try to figure out which has the best evidence supporting it.
Then let's set the stage with a brief look at the book itself. What are the basic facts we should know?
Well, the Book of Revelation is commonly placed last in canonical order in modern Bibles, and many people assume that it was the last book of the Bible to be written. But the real reason it's placed last is because it deals with the end of the world. That's the basic fact about why it's last. It's not because it was written last. It just deals with the end of the world. And so it's placed last for that reason, and it may or may not have been written last. In terms of who wrote it, the author names himself 4 times in the book. In the very first verse, he describes the book by calling it
the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place. He made it known by sending his angel to his servant John.
So John is the name of the book's author, and he confirms that in 3 other places in the book. Unfortunately, John was an extremely common name among Jews at the time. There are multiple Johns in the New Testament, and the author didn't tell us which one he was. Many have assumed that he was the apostle, John, son of Zebedee, but there is a tradition that is endorsed by multiple church fathers that says it was another John, who was an eyewitness of Jesus' ministry and was known as John the Presbyter or John the Elder. Presbyter and elder mean the same thing. For our purposes, we can call him John of Patmos.
And why would we want to call him that?
Because that's where the book was written. A few verses later, John says,
I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos, on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus.
So John says he was on the island of Patmos, and he goes on to describe the vision that he had while he was on Patmos. That vision is what the book of Revelation describes. Patmos is one of the Greek islands just off the coast of modern Turkey, or the Roman province of Asia Minor, as it used to be called, and the book is addressed to what John calls the 7 churches that are in Asia. So John was writing to these 7 churches in Turkey from the island of Patmos just off the coast. There were additional first-century churches in Asia Minor that we know about, but John is writing to 7 of them. Since John says that he was on Patmos on account of the Word of God and the testimony of Jesus, many people have inferred that he had been banished there because of his preaching of the Word of God, bearing witness to Jesus Christ, and that's almost certainly correct. But many people have inferred that he was in prison and that Patmos had a prison colony, and that appears to be incorrect. We don't have evidence for that. Instead, it appears that John was just banished or exiled to Patmos. This was a common punishment in the Roman Empire when they didn't want to execute someone, but they also didn't want that person running around on the mainland causing problems. For example, the Emperor Augustus famously banished his daughter Julia the Elder to the island of Pantelism. She was exiled there in 2 BC, about the same time Jesus was born. Pantelism is a really tiny place. It's just 0.59 square miles, or 1.5 square kilometers. But let's hear from Augustus's wife, the Empress Livia.
Your Aunt Julia. Do you remember her? She was sent to an island called Pantelism. It's a few minutes' walk from end to end. But I shouldn't think she walks it much anymore. She's been on it for 7 years.
Now, the emperor's daughter was someone who was high up in society. She was definitely upper class. And that points out something else about banishments, which is that it was a punishment that tended to be given to the upper class. If you were lower class, they'd just execute you or sentence you to manual labor, like working in the mines or something. So the fact that John got banished suggests that he was also upper class, perhaps a member of the Jerusalem elite. And that suggests that John of Patmos was not John, son of Zebedee, because the Apostle John was an uneducated Galilean fisherman and thus definitely lower class. In fact, in Acts 4:13, it describes the reaction of the Jerusalem council to Peter and John and says,
"Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, and perceived that they were uneducated, common men, they were astonished."
Only the word here translated uneducated in Greek is agrammatoi, which literally means illiterate, which raises a question about whether John could even write without the aid of a scribe. In any event, the fact banishment was used for the upper class suggests that the author of Revelation was John the Elder rather than John, son of Zebedee. But we can discuss the two individuals in a future episode.
Do we have any idea when Revelation was written?
This is something I discussed in a bit more detail in episode 68 of the Jimmy Akin podcast, so you can check that out for more information. But in the 20th century, the most common opinion was that Revelation was written in the AD 90s, like around AD 95 or 96. However, in the 19th century, the most common opinion was that it was written in the AD 60s, and I think that is the most likely view. Based on clues inside the book, I would date it to the second half of AD 68, just after Nero's suicide and during the reign of his successor Galba. But check out episode 68 of the Jimmy Akin podcast for a sketch of the reasons why.
Is there anything else we should know about the book before we start looking at how it has been interpreted?
The book of Revelation explicitly states, both at its beginning and at its end, that it describes what will happen soon. From John's perspective. At the beginning of the book, Revelation 1:1 says that the book is
the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his servants the things that must soon take place.
And at the end of the book, Revelation 22:6 says that
these words are trustworthy and true, and the Lord, the God of the spirits of the prophets, has sent his angel to show his servants what must soon take place.
But when we look more closely, we find passages that raise some questions. It's very clear that the early part of the book is describing things that pertain to the first century, when the book was written. Chapters 2 and 3 of the book contain a set of 7 messages from Jesus to the 7 churches that the book is written to. And these messages clearly apply to first century churches. For example, Revelation 2 contains a message from Jesus to the church at Ephesus, and in that message, Jesus says,
I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear with those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles, and are not, and found them to be false.
Here, Jesus is speaking to a church that existed in the first century. It no longer exists today. Ephesus is a set of ruins today, an archaeological site, not a place where people live. Further, Jesus is describing its first century activities in this verse, including testing people who call themselves apostles, with the apostles being people who were around in the first century but not later. So it looks like the messages to the seven churches definitely pertain to the beginning of Christian history. But later in the book, we hit a point where we're dealing with events that have to be placed centuries later. In Revelation 20, we read,
An angel seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while.
There's a question here about whether the 1,000 years is literally a period of 10 centuries or whether it's just a stock number indicating a very long period of time that's likely even longer. But even if it's only 10 centuries, the devil would not be released from the pit until the 11th century at the earliest, and that indicates that this passage pertains to events centuries later, long after John's time. Similarly, a bit later in Revelation 20 we read,
And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done.
Here we have the resurrection of the dead in Judgment Day. That's not only going to be centuries after John's time, given the millennium, it's also a pair of events that are still in our future. So it's clear that the book of Revelation starts with events in the first century in our past, and it ends with events that are still in our future.
Then a question every interpretation will need to answer is how Revelation gets from here to there. How does it start in our past but end up in our future? That's going to affect how you read the different passages in the book.
Correct. It's clear that the beginning of Revelation, chapters 1 to 3, which contain the messages to the seven churches of Asia, deals with events in John's own day, while the end of the book, chapters 21 to 22, which describe the new heavens and the new earth, deals with the distant future. But what about the middle of the book, chapters 4 to 20? Over time, several views have developed, and we'll look at 5 of them: Futurism, Historicism, Idealism, Preterism, and Pantelism. There are many variations on these views, but they all tend to fall into one of these 5 basic categories. In the second half of the 20th century, the most common view was Futurism. This view holds that very little of the book pertains to the beginning of Christian history, and the bulk of the book pertains to events that are still in our future. This is the view that was held by figures like Hal Lindsey in his books, including The Late Great Planet Earth, and by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins in their Left Behind series of novels. However, Futurism only became popular in the second half of the 20th century, after World War II, and it's begun to be less popular in recent years. For much of church history, one of the most popular views was Historicism. According to this view, the chapters of Revelation cover the entirety of church history in a more or less even fashion, so you could map events from early in Revelation, say chapter 4, onto events early in church history, say the 4th century. Then you could map events from later in Revelation, say chapter 10, to events later in church history, like, say, the 10th century. And you could map events late in the book, like chapter 19, to events that are still later in church history, maybe the 19th century. And so you could use Revelation as basically a roadmap of events throughout the entire church age. However, for some people, this view was too specific, and so they proposed an alternative that's sometimes called idealism. According to idealism, Revelation, or at least the middle chapters of it, 4 through 20, do describe the events of church history, but they don't do so in a way that gives you a roadmap. Instead, they describe the general kinds of events that will happen in each age of church history. So just because you read about a judgment that happens at one point in Revelation, it doesn't mean that it refers to a judgment that happens just in one certain century of Christian history. Instead, it refers to a kind of judgment that happens over and over again in history. So Revelation doesn't give you a roadmap of the Christian age. It just gives you a general description of the kinds of events that will be happening regularly. An interesting variation on this view was proposed by the author William Hendrickson in his book More Than Conquerors. Basically, Hendrickson proposed that Revelation walks through church history 7 times, so it gives you a cyclical view of events that will occur multiple times in the Christian age. This is an interesting view, but I ultimately don't think it's correct. In particular, I have problems with the idea that Revelation can be divided into 7 sections the way Hendrickson needs it to. So we won't be focusing on this view today, and will ultimately treat it as a variation of the idealist view, since it holds that the middle of Revelation describes events that will be recurring over and over again in church history. Our next to last view is Preterism. This comes from a Latin root. Praeter means past or beyond, so Preterism means that the bulk of Revelation is now in our past. We're beyond those events. This view is basically the opposite of Futurism. Instead of holding that the bulk of the book describes events in our future, it holds that the bulk of the book describes events in our past, towards the beginning of church history. So much of the book did indeed happen soon from John's audience's perspective on a preterist interpretation, but there are still parts of the book that pertain to events in our future. Finally, there's a minority viewpoint that has sometimes been called full preterism or complete preterism or hyper-preterism, but it's also been called Pantelism, and I prefer this term because it makes it clear that there is a real and important distinction between it and normal preterism. The term Pantelism comes from Greek roots. Pan means all, and telos means end or fulfillment. So Pantelism means all biblical prophecy, including all of Revelation, is ended. It's all been fulfilled, so there are no prophecies in Revelation or otherwise that still pertain to our future. This view is like Preterism in that it holds most of the book of Revelation pertains to our past, but it's different in that it holds that all of Revelation pertains to our past. Pantelism has always been an extreme minority viewpoint, but it has picked up a few adherents in recent years, so I wanted to include it too. We thus now have a basic overview of the 5 interpretations we'll be discussing today.
Very good. Now, before we move on to our faith and reason perspectives, I'd like to take a moment now to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Frederick H., Thomas P., Roseanne M., Dina C., and Martin P. Their generous donations at givemysterious.fm make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. More than 90% of our financial support comes from individual donors like you, and you can join them by visiting givemysterious.fm. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by the Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at GradyGroupInc.com. So, Jimmy, since we're talking about a religious mystery today, how will we be handling this in terms of the faith and reason perspectives?
Well, it's a little tricky this time because some of the things I'll say, in fact, most of the things I'll say have to do with the reason perspective, while some of them will also be from the faith perspective. Normally, when that happens, I pull the two perspectives apart. I give you all the reason perspective items in a batch, and then I give you all the faith perspective items in a batch, sometimes with 1 or 2 items done out of sequence because it's easier to explain and understand them that way. And I'll say things like, well, speaking from the faith perspective for a moment, or speaking from the reason perspective for a moment, to signal the fact that I'm introducing some out-of-sequence material. However, today, the relative considerations are intertwined in such a way that makes it harder to pull them apart and present them separately. Consequently, today we'll be doing a combined faith and reason perspective where I don't pull the considerations apart the way I normally do. I wanted to include this as a comment now, though, because I want to let people know that I will be switching back and forth between the two perspectives without flagging them, so you can be aware of that.
Then let's go through the 5 perspectives and look at them in more detail. We'll start with what historically has been a very popular perspective, which is Historicism. So what should we know about that?
Well, it's easy to see how a view like this could develop. Many early Christians assumed that Jesus would be returning in their own lifetimes. For example, in 1 Thessalonians 4:15, St. Paul writes,
"This we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep."
In this passage, those who have fallen asleep are deceased Christians, and Paul is telling the Thessalonians that these deceased Christians will not miss out on the kingdom at the second coming. In fact, they'll be raised first. So that's the deceased Christians, but note which category Paul puts himself in. He says, we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord. So he's expecting to still be alive at the second coming. Paul eventually learned that that wouldn't be the case, at least not for him. In 2 Timothy, in his last letter, Paul writes, "I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." So now Paul knows that he's not going to live until the second coming. He's writing for prison, and he knows he's going to be executed soon. Then John of Patmos learned that the end of the world was even further off. In Revelation 20, which we've already mentioned, there is the disclosure that at least a millennium, 1,000 years, would occur before the end of the world. Well, that reoriented Christian expectations. For many living in the 1st and 2nd century, it would be natural to assume that they were living in the middle of the book of Revelation and that soon the later events of the book would arrive. However, as church history progressed, Christians in the 3rd, 4th, and subsequent centuries would need to extend the timeline that the middle of the book is supposed to cover. Eventually, the timeline was stretched to cover the entirety of the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the Reformation. And so the historicist interpretation grew as church history got longer. As a result, people began viewing Revelation as a kind of roadmap of church history, with the chapters spread out more or less evenly across the different centuries of the Christian age. Some Catholic authors in the Middle Ages adopted the historicist view, but it became extremely popular among Protestants. And it was the dominant view among the reformers, who identified the beast or Antichrist figure of the book with the papacy and used this to demonize the Catholic Church. In his book Revelation, 4 Views, Steve Gregg writes, "For example, the breaking of the 7 seals, chapters 6 and 7, is often said to be the barbarian invasions that sacked the Western Roman Empire. The scorpion and locusts that come out of the bottomless pit, chapter 9, are the Arab hordes attacking the Eastern Roman Empire, followed by the Turks, represented as the horses, with serpents for tails and flamethrowers for mouths. The beast, chapter 13, represents the Roman papacy." Historicism continued to be popular in Protestant circles until the 19th century, but it rapidly fell out of popularity as its shortcomings were becoming ever more obvious. While historicism is still held among Seventh-day Adventists, it's otherwise completely fallen out of favor among Protestants, and it's not taken seriously by New Testament scholars of any persuasion today. And why is that? Why did it lose popularity? As time advanced, the arbitrariness of historicist interpretations became ever clearer. Interpreters always tended to assume that they were living near the end of Revelation. So as the number of centuries that the book needed to cover increased, the interpretations of particular passages kept having to change. For example, a historicist living before the time of Muhammad, who was born around AD 570 and died in AD 632, well, that kind of person would not see Muhammad in the book at all. But after the devastating invasions of Christendom by Muslim forces, a place for the rise of Islam needed to be found in the book. And later in history, a commenter was writing, the earlier in the book mention of Muhammad would need to be. Similarly, interpreters living before the Reformation or Hitler or communism would not see these in the book, but afterwards they would want to find passages referring to them, forcing a reinterpretation of those passages. And as the amount of time Revelation needed to cover stretched, more and more historicist commentaries that disagreed with each other came to be written, leading to a realization that identifications of particular symbols within the book with particular historical events was essentially arbitrary and not grounded in good exegesis. Another factor leading to the realization of historicism's arbitrariness is that commentators sought to interpret the book almost exclusively in terms of European Christendom, with European popes and kings and wars and invasions dominating the interpretation of the book's symbols. But after the Age of Exploration, Christianity was a global phenomenon, and it was not clear why Revelation should be focused exclusively on Europe and ignore developments in the rest of the Christian world. By the 19th century, the Protestant denominations were sufficiently established that they felt secure enough they no longer needed to demonize the Catholic Church to the same degree, and as passions cooled, Protestant scholars realized that the papacy does not fit the biblical data regarding the Antichrist. They thus no longer needed to interpret Revelation in a historicist way as a means to justify their rejection of the Catholic Church. And in view of all this, the view rapidly fell out of favor, except among Seventh-day Adventists who still maintain a connection between the Antichrist and the papacy. In addition to the arbitrariness that historicism involves, scholars today also fault it because this view would make the bulk of the book totally irrelevant to its original audience. If Revelation were a roadmap of church history, with specific judgments corresponding to specific events in distant centuries, there is no way that John's original readers could have understood what it was referring to. Such identifications could be recognized only in hindsight at best. Yet John emphasizes that the contents of the vision are to happen soon, and he expects the reader to be able to figure out symbols in the middle of the book, like when he says,
"This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666.
Well, Revelation 13, which is where that passage comes from, is more than halfway through the book. So if Revelation gives us a roadmap of church history, the beast wouldn't arrive for centuries. And so nobody in John's original audience would have had the wisdom that John says you need to calculate the number of the beast. Yet John expects some in his audience to have this wisdom, which is why he points it out in the first place. Factors like this thus led to a widespread realization that historicism is an unworkable interpretation, and so it's dwindled down today to almost nothing.
Then let's look at a more workable theory. Tell us about idealism and how idealists interpret the book.
The idealist view of Revelation goes by a variety of names, including the spiritual or symbolic view. Idealism is similar to historicism in that it sees the middle of the book as relating to all of church history, but it doesn't see it as providing a roadmap or timeline of this period. Instead, it relates to church history in a more general way. Idealism began to be popular in the 19th century as the historicist view was falling out of favor, and it's easy to see why a view like this would arise. If it proved impossible to match passages in Revelation to specific events in the course of church history, as in historicism, then it would be natural to ask if they might apply to history in a less specific, more general fashion. Thus, Revelation came to be understood by idealists as describing the great conflict between God and Satan that plays out in every part of church history. While God will ultimately be victorious, believers in every age will need to face the challenges that the book of Revelation describes, including persecutions and other disasters. For example, Revelation 6, verses 3 to 8, describes a series of horsemen who unambiguously represent war, famine, and death. These are three of the famous four horsemen of the apocalypse, that is, the four horsemen of the book of Revelation. We're going to skip the first horseman on the white horse because exactly what this horseman means is debated, but there's no doubt that the other horsemen represent war, famine, and death. We read,
"When he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, 'Come!' And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. When he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, 'Come!' And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures, saying, 'A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and wine.' When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, 'Come!' And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth."
Well, war, famine, and death aren't confined to a single event in history. They occur over and over again. Idealists take this as a sign that Christians in every age must be prepared to face these challenges without seeing the passage as referring to an occasion where a specific war led to famine and death. On this view, the passage represents a principle that can recur over and over again in history rather than referring to one particular occasion. Because idealism holds that Revelation deals with themes that recur throughout church history as it builds to its ultimate climax, some have referred to this as the philosophy of history interpretation, as Revelation would be seeking to provide a Christian perspective on the meaning of the church age. Some idealists have also seen Revelation as proceeding through the church age more than once. As we mentioned, the well-known Protestant author William Hendrickson argued in his book More Than Conquerors that Revelation contains 7 segments, each of which proceeds through the church age, but with different symbols and emphases. He referred to his view, as progressive parallelism. Idealism has become very popular in modern commentaries on Revelation, especially in the scholarly community. Perhaps one reason for this is that it frees the commentator from the need to identify passages in Revelation with specific historical events, and so it allows him to write a commentary that can be read by advocates of the other schools, especially Futurism and Preterism, without having to decide the contentious questions that separate them. The chief problem with idealism is that John does seem to be predicting things that are rather specific, and he emphasizes that Revelation was written to show his servants the things that must soon take place. As a result, many idealists combine their approaches with one of the others, and given the first century context in which John was writing, idealism is most commonly combined with preterism, though it also is sometimes combined with futurism.
Then let's talk about futurism and its advocates. How do they interpret Revelation?
Rather than seeing Revelation as applying to the whole of church history, as historicists and idealists do, futurists hold that the bulk of the book, or chapters 4 to 20, apply to events that are still in our future. When the Protestant reformers began using historicism to attack the Catholic Church, 2 Spanish Jesuits proposed alternative readings. Steve Gregg writes,
One response was that of Francisco Ribera, 1537 to 1591, a professor at Salamanca, who taught that John in Revelation only foresaw events of the near future and of the final things at the end of the world, but had none of the intervening history in view. The Antichrist was defined as a future individual who would arise in the end times. Babylon was seen as Rome, not under the popes, but in a future corrupted state. This was the beginning of many of the ideas that are now part of the futurist approach to Revelation.
Initially, futurism was not popular among Protestants who saw it as a Catholic attempt to avoid their criticisms. However, this began to change in the 19th century, and futurism became more popular in Protestant circles. In particular, futurism was adopted by the Anglo-Irish clergyman John Nelson Darby. Darby became a leader in a sect known as the Plymouth Brethren, and he incorporated futurism as a pillar in a theological system he developed known as dispensationalism. According to this view, world history is divided into a number of periods, or dispensations, in which God deals with mankind in different ways. One of these dispensations is a future 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth known as the millennium. Dispensationalists also introduced the idea that this period would be preceded by a rapture, in which all true believers would be caught up to be with Jesus in heaven, while the Antichrist reigned on earth during a period called the tribulation. There are several variants on the rapture idea, which we talked about back in episode 357. After the tribulation, Christ would return, slay the Antichrist, and inaugurate a 1,000-year kingdom. Only after this would the end of the world come. Dispensationalism was promoted in America by the theologian C.I. Scofield, who incorporated it into the notes of his popular study Bible, the Scofield Reference Bible. Although dispensationalism and thus futurism had been gaining ground in the 19th century, it really took off after World War II. The two world wars that took place in the first half of the 20th century, the fear of atomic war, and the refounding of the State of Israel, made it look like apocalyptic events were in our near future, and that naturally led people to try to apply Revelation to our future, at least here in America. Dispensationalism and futurism have always been more popular here than in elsewhere in the world. By the mid-20th century, dispensationalism had become extremely popular in American evangelicalism, and it was further popularized by books such as Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth in the 1970s and Tim LaHaye's Left Behind series in the 1990s. These books proved so popular that the dispensationalist understanding of Revelation, with its belief in a rapture and an earthly 1,000-year reign of Christ, entered pop culture, and many today just assume that this is the standard or even the only way to understand Revelation, and that Christians have always done that, even though this has actually been a minority view that's only had some recent popularity. Despite this, there have also been futurists who do not accept a dispensationalist interpretation of the book. They don't believe in the pre-tribulation rapture and other aspects that are unique to the dispensationalist system.
Whether they're dispensationalists or not, how do futurists argue for their interpretation?
Futurists often claim that Revelation should be taken in a highly literal sense, and by confining its events to our future, their view is uniquely able to do this. Steve Gregg writes,
For example, there has never been a time in the past when a third of the sea turned to blood, killing a third of the fish and sinking a third of the ships. Revelation 8. If this is to have a literal fulfillment, it must still be in the future. Other approaches must take the passage non-literally.
But despite their emphasis on a literal interpretation, futurists acknowledge that Revelation contains a large number of symbols. For example, in Revelation 12 we read,
Another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth.
Futurists of all sorts recognize that this is a symbol of the devil, that the devil is not a literal red dragon, and that he will not literally sweep a third of the stars out of the sky with his tail. So it's not a question of whether the book of Revelation should be read literally. Instead, it's a question of what mix of literal symbols and symbolic readings best explains the book. This means that the futurist argument that they take the book literally isn't really a decisive argument, since everyone sees a mix of literal and symbolic elements in it. Of course, people are naturally curious about the future, and a chief attraction of futurism is that it would allow Revelation to give us a detailed map of events that are still to come. I've even seen some futurists say that, well, their view must be true, because if futurism isn't true, then we don't have a detailed map of the future. Well, maybe we just don't. Just because we might like to have a detailed map of the future doesn't mean that this interpretation is true. God may have simply not willed to give us a detailed map.
And that gets us into the topic of problems with futurism. So what problems are there?
One of the main problems of Futurism is that if it were true, it would make the large majority of the book of Revelation irrelevant to its original audience. That's because it would be describing events occurring thousands of years after John's time. I mean, literally thousands of years, since we're already 2,000 years after the time of Christ, and futurists say the bulk of Revelation is still in our future. This would not sit easily with John's repeated assurances to his audience that the events in the book will happen soon. We saw those references earlier, some of them anyway. Neither would the original audience be able to understand the prophecies in the book, as John expects them to when he tells the original audience to calculate the number of the beast. That presupposes that the number of the beast was something you could calculate in the first century, since John is talking to first century people and telling them that, well, with wisdom, you could do this. But on Futurism, there is no way that people in the first century could have calculated the number of a man's name when the man wouldn't even be born for thousands of years. You can check out episode 138 for more information on the mark of the beast and precisely who a wise first century reader of Revelation would have calculated it to be. Fundamentally, the bulk of Revelation would be irrelevant to Christians living in every generation except the last. Only the final Christians would be able to correctly interpret the events of the book and draw practical lessons from them. So that makes the book basically irrelevant to all generations of Christians except the last, or those just before the last, and thus makes it irrelevant to the actual audience that John was writing to. Another problem for the futurist reading is that the beginning of the book just does not contain a large jump in time. The material in chapters 1 to 3 explicitly deals with the first century, like the circumstances in the 7 churches of Asia to whom the book is written. But futurists got to get to the future somehow, and so they typically hold that at the beginning of chapter 4, there is a sudden leap of 2 or more thousand years into the future. Some attempt to find this in chapter 4, verse 1. After John has relayed the messages to the 7 churches, he says,
"And after this I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this.'"
Since the rapture is not mentioned in the book, dispensationalist futurists frequently see the command to John to come up here as indicating the point at which the church is supposed to be raptured. However, this is not a literal reading of the text. The text does not say anything about Jesus descending from heaven to rapture his church away so that they'll be protected from the reign of the Antichrist. Instead, it's got Jesus in heaven, and then it refers to John and John alone being caught up to heaven, and not so that John can be protected, but so he can see the vision that the book contains. So that's a problem for dispensational futurists who believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. But it's an even worse problem for non-dispensational futurists, since Revelation 4:1 would give them no reason at all to suspect that this text suddenly leaps over 2,000 years or more of church history. Fundamentally, a leap of 2,000 or more years is just not indicated in the text. The text simply says that John will be shown what will take place after what he's already seen, but after would not be understood by the original audience to mean thousands of years later, not when they have been told that the events will happen soon. And when John has been told in Revelation 20:10,
"Do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this book, for the time is near."
Now, I should mention that there is another way that some futurists attempt to bridge the gap between the past and the future in Revelation. Some futurists hold that the way to get from our past to our future is by looking at the messages to the 7 churches of Asia that the book is written to. The idea is that although these 7 churches literally existed in the first century, and although chapters 2 and 3 genuinely describe events in the first century that took place in them, the 7 churches also represent 7 ages of church history. and that these ages stretch from the beginning of church history to its end, so that by the time we get to chapter 4 of Revelation, we end up in our future, with or without a reference to the rapture in chapter 4, verse 1.
What do you make of this interpretation of chapters 2 and 3?
I think it's a lousy interpretation. Advocates of futurism pride themselves for interpreting the book of Revelation literally, meaning in reading it in accordance with the words used in the text. Well, there are no words in the text that suggest this. There are no words like, by the way, even though these messages are for 7 first-century churches, they also each represent an age of future church history in order so that you can use them as a shrunken roadmap of church history to get to the future. Furthermore, just like historicists, futurists who advocate this view always assume they're living just before the end, so they have to periodically revise their interpretations of these 7 ages. I've even seen futurists call out their fellow futurist brethren for going beyond what the text says when interpreting these churches as ages of history, and incidentally violating the Protestant principle of sola scriptura, or the idea that we should form theology by scripture alone instead of sticking with what the text actually says. So I think this church age theory is a lousy perspective. It's speculative, and it just has no basis in the text itself. And in part because of these difficulties, futurism has largely fallen out of popularity, at least among scholars. It is most common in popular-level expositions of Revelation, though there are still a few scholarly commentaries with this perspective.
Then let's look at another school of thought. How do preterists interpret Revelation?
As we said, preterists hold that the bulk of the book of Revelation was fulfilled before our time and applies to the early part of church history. On this view, chapters 1 to 19 deal with events in or near Jesus' own time. Then there's a long period described symbolically as 1,000 years, after which comes the end of the world. This solves the problem of how to get from the past to the future in the book. The great majority of the text does deal with events that would happen soon from John's perspective. There is then the long period of time he indicates, the period in which we're now living, and finally there are the events that are still in our future. There had been preterists in the early church, but the view received new attention after the Protestant reformers began to use historicism to demonize the Catholic Church. While one Spanish Jesuit, Francisco Ribera, proposed a futurist reading,
another Jesuit scholar, Luis de Alcazar, 1554 to 1613, introduced a preterist approach to Revelation, in which chapters 4 through 11 were interpreted as depicting the church's struggle against Judaism, culminating in the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Chapters 12 through 19 as the church's struggle with paganism, ending in the fall of Rome in 476, and chapters 20 through 22 as the triumph of the church in papal Rome.
I should point out that the interpretation proposed by Luis de Alcazar is not the only preterist one. There are several versions of preterism. The main differences concern whether the book deals with God's judgment on Jerusalem, Rome, or both. One view holds that the book covers the same events that Jesus did in the Olivet Discourse, in which he prophesied the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in AD 70. For example, at the beginning of Mark 13, we read,
As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?"
Jesus then goes on to give a discourse about the events that will take place before the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and this passage in Mark has parallels in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. Since the discourse was given on the Mount of Olives, it's often called the Olivet Discourse. Many people have erroneously thought that this discourse is about the end of the world, but it's not. Futurists in particular have misread it this way, but it is a misreading, as becomes clear if you read how the discourse began. Jesus had just come out of the temple. A disciple commented on the wonderful buildings of the temple complex. Jesus said that these great buildings will be thrown down. Then Peter, James, and John ask him, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? In other words, when will the temple be destroyed, and what sign should we look for? That is the subject of the Olivet Discourse, not the end of the world. Well, some preterists have held that the bulk of Revelation covers the same thing. This view identifies the whore of Babylon, which we read about in Revelation 17 and 18, as the apostate city of Jerusalem, which executed the Messiah. On their view, chapters 4 to 19 deal with the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple, and then the rest of the book deals with events that are at the end of the world. On the other hand, other preterists hold that the whore of Babylon is pagan Rome, which persecuted Christians. On this view, Revelation may deal with God's judgment on Roman paganism and its defeat by the advance of the gospel. Some, such as Luis de Alcazar, have thought that the book deals with the judgment on both Jerusalem and Rome. He did this by dividing the book into two sections, one for each city. The first part of the book deals with the judgment on apostate Jerusalem, and the second part deals with the judgment on pagan Rome. Still others have proposed that the whore of Babylon represents both Jerusalem and Rome, and perhaps any great city that sets itself in opposition to God. The key thing to be aware of is that in Preterism, there are different interpretations of specific symbols in Revelation, like which city the whore of Babylon is, just like there are different interpretations of major symbols in Historicism, Idealism, and Futurism. Now, because Preterism undermined Reformation-era rhetoric, it was not initially popular with Protestants. However, after the passions of that period had cooled, it began to attract Protestant adherents. Variations on Preterism are common in scholarly commentaries on Revelation, often combined with the idealist view, and in recent years there have been an increasing number of popular-level works advocating Preterism in Protestant circles.
Let's talk now about the fifth interpretation you mentioned, Pantelism. What should we know here?
Like I said, Pantelism is an extreme minority viewpoint. It's so small that Steve Gregg doesn't even have a section for it in his book Revelation for Views. It's a view that's come up only in recent years. At least it has achieved its greatest prominence in recent years. And it's an extreme version of Preterism that's only been advocated by a very small number of people. On Pantelist views, it is not just the bulk of Revelation that has been fulfilled, as we said, but all biblical prophecy, including prophecies of the second coming, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment. The Pantelists I'm familiar with also hold the view that Revelation deals with the same material as the Olivet Discourse, and that this all deals with events leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70.
Okay, now that we've been through the views in a bit more detail, it's time for you to give your analysis of them, Jimmy. Which views do you think have the best evidence in favor of them, and which do you think have the least chance of being true?
Well, we're going to start at the bottom with the views that I think are least plausible and then work our way up towards those that I think are most plausible. To do this, we're going to do something we haven't done before on Mysterious World, which is to use a tier list with the least likely views at the bottom and the most likely views at the top.
Okay, then what's at the very bottom of your tier list?
It's Pantelism, and there are two reasons for this. First, Revelation contains prophecies of the resurrection of the dead and the final judgment. For example, in Revelation 20, we read,
"Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Then another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them. And they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire."
So here, the dead are raised back to life and judged, and even death itself is destroyed. Then, in Revelation 21, we read,
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away.
So in this passage, the heavenly city, New Jerusalem, has come down from heaven, and pain and suffering have passed away. Well, none of these things have happened. The dead have not been raised. The final judgment has not taken place. We are not living in the New Jerusalem, and suffering most definitely still exists. Pantalists must therefore try to find alternate ways to interpret these passages so that they can claim them to have happened. But their alternative interpretations are simply not convincing. It's blindingly obvious that these things have not yet occurred. And these facts have been so obvious to Christians throughout all centuries that it brings us to the second major problem with Pantelism, which is that the church has infallibly defined that some events are still in our future. Thus, in the Nicene Creed, the church confesses,
Jesus will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. And I look forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Amen.
Since the Nicene Creed is infallible, that infallibly defines that the second coming of Christ, the final judgment, Christ's endless kingdom, the resurrection of the dead, and the life of the world to come are all still future. Their future occurrence has thus been revealed by God and defined as such by the magisterium of the church. And since Pantelism denies this, that means it's heretical. Heresy being a refusal to believe what has been infallibly defined to be divine revelation. Pantelism thus involves both absurd biblical interpretations and actual heresy, so it goes to F tier on the list.
Okay, then what's the next position you want to evaluate?
Well, I hate to say it, but it's Futurism, and this may surprise some folks because Futurism has been so popular in recent years, though it's presently losing popularity. Stick with me, though, because I'm going to do something in a bit that will take some of the sting out of this statement by doing a partial rehabilitation of Futurism. Though at the moment, I'm considering Futurism in its pure form, which holds that the bulk of the book of Revelation all deals with our future. And that's a problem, because both the very first verse of the book and also the end of the book state that the vision it reveals will take place soon. We may know that part of that vision is still in the future, but at a minimum, the bulk of the vision, the main subject of it, must take place soon from John and his audience's perspective. Otherwise, the book was lying to him. And no ducking and dodging here about there being a prophetic meaning for soon that is different from the normal meaning. That is not how John and his audience would have understood the term. There are also multiple links to the first century in the bulk of the vision, some of which I'll mention soon. But the bulk of the book simply must refer to events at the beginning of church history, which is the opposite of what Futurism holds. And there is nothing near the front of the book to indicate a sudden jump of thousands of years into the future, including the messages to the 7 churches of Asia, which in no way indicate that they're a squished roadmap of church history, making that complete supposition. We thus have the book representing the opposite of what Futurism says it represents, coupled with an inexplicable multi-thousand-year time jump that the book doesn't even mention. So I'm afraid that from an exegetical perspective, Futurism is just fundamentally poor biblical interpretation, and so it goes on to the D tier of the list.
Okay, then what's the next step up from that in terms of interpretation?
That would be Historicism. Now, Historicism has a huge problem in that, like Futurism, it makes the book of Revelation basically irrelevant to John's audience, since there's no way to make sense of its prophecies except in hindsight. It also has a big problem in that each proposed interpretation gets falsified, since people always interpret the book as if they're living close to the end, so that makes people keep having to reinterpret the book's symbols as the roadmap of church history gets restretched to cover a longer period. And much of the book in no way happens soon from John's perspective. There are also links to first century realities in parts of the book where there shouldn't be. For example, we meet the beast in chapter 13 in the middle of the book. So on Historicism, you would expect the beast to refer to a reality in the middle of church history. But the beast has clear links to the first century. For example, in chapter 13, John sees that the beast has 7 heads, and later in chapter 17, we're told,
"This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman is seated. They are also 7 kings, 5 of whom have fallen. One is, the other has not yet to come, and when he does come, he must remain only a little while."
The 7 mountains have been recognized for centuries as being the 7 hills of Rome, and the 7 kings represent the line of first century Roman emperors, since we're also told that the beast demands worship, the way the first century Roman emperors did, and that it persecutes Christians, the way that first century Roman emperors did. And when the horror of Babylon that rides the beast finally falls, we're told,
"Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her."
So the whore and the beast persecuted apostles and New Testament prophets, with apostles only existing in the first century. And back in chapter 13, we were told,
"This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666.
And when you do that, it so happens that the name Nero Caesar adds up to 666. So when you put all that together, we find references to first century realities like pagan Rome, first century emperors, emperor worship, and the Emperor Nero in parts of the book like chapters 13, 17, and 18, where Historicism and Futurism says they shouldn't appear. But at least Historicism has one significant advantage over Futurism, and that is that it allows more of the book to happen soon. And it doesn't require us to leap over multiple thousands of years to get to the subject matter of the main part of the book. It's still bending the word soon to make soon cover the entirety of the multi-thousand-year church age, but at least it allows the time period to start soon, rather than leaping over it entirely the way Futurism does. So Historicism does less violence to the text than Futurism. And as a result, we can put Historicism on the C level of our list.
Okay, now we're getting into the top part of the tier list. What comes next?
That would be Idealism. Idealism is basically Historicism with the numbers filed off, so you don't have to tie symbols in Revelation to specific events on a roadmap of history. It holds that the book covers things that will happen over and over again, so the interpretation of the book doesn't keep getting falsified the way historicist interpretations do, and you don't keep having to change the interpretation of symbols in the book as you restretch the roadmap of church history. So this is a stronger interpretation of the book. The weakness is that it still doesn't do full justice to the book's main events happening soon, but at least it's not constantly being falsified. So I would put this on the B tier of our list.
We're almost at the top of the tier list now, so what would you put here?
Preterism. This interpretation has the best evidence for it as being the literal interpretation of the book. It alone does justice to Revelation's statements that it concerns what must soon take place. As I discussed in episode 68 of the Jimmy Akin podcast, the book was most likely written in the second half of AD 68 on the theory that the book primarily concerns the events leading up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Well, That would be very soon indeed, just 2 years. On the theory that the book deals with the age of persecutions that ended when the Roman Empire legalized Christianity, well, that would still be soon, in that the events of the book would start basically immediately, and they would end soon in historic terms in the early Christian centuries, at least after you knew that church history was going to go on for that long. Either way you go, on Preterism, the main subject of the book, whether it's God's judgment on Jerusalem or on his judgment on Roman paganism or both, well, happened soon. And that's a superior sense of soon compared to historicism and idealism, which would require the word soon to stretch to include more than 2,000 years to cover all of church history. And it's vastly better than Futurism, which must completely detach the word soon from anything like its normal meaning and simply leap over those millennia. Preterism also explains why we have so many first-century references in the book, and in parts of the book that happened in the soon period from this perspective. It explains why there are references to the beast and the whore of Babylon in chapters 13, 17, and 18, including the specific references to Rome, Roman emperors, emperor worship, and Nero specifically. When it comes to how we get from the beginning of the Christian age to events that are still in our future, Preterism also explains that. There is a big stretch of time, the 1,000 years of the millennium, and it occurs in the correct place in the book, in chapter 20, almost at the end. So the bulk of the book describes events that will happen soon from John and his audience's perspective. We're now living in the long stretch of time represented by the millennium, and after that, there will be a brief period that includes the end of the world. I thus give Preterism very high marks for explaining the data of the book, and as being the interpretation that is best supported by the data. I thus assign Preterism to the A tier on our list.
Okay, we've now filled up our tier list from A to F, but there's still that S for superior slot that many people use on tier lists for things even better than A. Is there anything that can go here on our interpretations of Revelation list?
I think there is, and I've already hinted at it obliquely. Now I'll set the stage for it more explicitly. As I've often mentioned, every biblical text has a literal meaning. This is not the same as a literalistic meaning. Instead, the literal meaning is just what the author was trying to communicate to his audience, and that's not to be taken literalistically. For example, in English, we have the expression, roll out the red carpet. If I told someone to roll out a red carpet for a visiting dignitary, someone who understood me in a literalistic sense would think that, well, there must be an actual carpet that is actually red and that I want it actually rolled out on the ground for this dignitary. But that's not what I mean. Someone who understood me in the literal sense would recognize my true meaning, which is that I want to take special pains for our visitor, to make them feel welcome, to show them honor, and try to do everything right while they're here. That's what I'm trying to communicate by the phrase, roll out the red carpet. So the literal meaning of the phrase is not, there is a carpet that is red that must be rolled out on the ground. It means, try to be very respectful and kind and welcoming to this person. Or, to give an example from Revelation, there's the great red dragon that we see in chapter 12. Taken in a literalistic sense, you would think that John expects to see a giant flying reptile show up in the sky one day. But that's not what John is trying to communicate. The literal sense of the text, and thus the meaning of the symbol, the literal meaning, is that it's Satan. John is telling us something about the devil, not about an actual reptile. Well, like every other text in Scripture, Revelation has a literal meaning, and I've argued that this literal meaning is represented by preterism, the idea that most of the book would occur soon from John's point of view, even though that means most of the book now refers to our past. But the literal sense of a text is not its only one, at least not when it comes to the Bible, because Scripture is divinely inspired. So standing behind the human author is God, the divine author. And God is aware of more things than the human author is aware of. So God can build additional messages into Scripture, including ones the human author isn't even aware of. As a result, prophetic texts can have more than one fulfillment. They have a primary fulfillment that represents the literal sense of the text, but they can have other senses that are based on the spiritual sense of the text and that lead to fulfillments further in the future.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure, there are several examples in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah himself lived in the 700s BC, and one of the kings that Isaiah ministered under was named Ahaz of Judah. Well, at one point, Ahaz was very worried because the kings of Syria and Israel had teamed up against the kingdom of Judah. So God gave Ahaz a sign that he would not be defeated by these enemies. And God had Isaiah tell him,
"The Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land whose two kings you dread will be deserted."
So God says, in essence, I'll give you a sign to show you that you won't be defeated by the kings of Syria and Israel. A young woman's going to get pregnant. She's going to bear a son. That son will be called Emmanuel, which means God with us, or God is with us. He's on our side. And while that son is still small, before he learns what's helpful or harmful, the lands of Syria and Israel, the kingdom of Israel, not Judah, will be deserted. That's how much not a threat they will be to you. Now, this child had to be born in Ahaz's day, back in the 700s BC, in order to serve as a sign for King Ahaz. But the prophecy had another greater fulfillment when Jesus was born. He was Emmanuel, or God with us, in an even greater sense. And so the Gospel of Matthew states,
"Now the birth of Jesus Christ took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. And her husband, Joseph, being a just man and unwilling to put her to shame, resolved to divorce her quietly. But as he considered these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, 'Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins.' All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. 'Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel,' which means, is with us."
So the literal sense of Isaiah 7 referred to a baby being born in King Ahaz's day, but there is a second fulfillment in the spiritual sense that refers to Jesus. And this is just one example. There are many others. Consequently, even though the bulk of Revelation may have its literal fulfillment early in church history, that doesn't prevent it from also having additional fulfillments in other later ages, including just before the end of the world. This allows us to put Preterism in the S tier as the primary literal interpretation of Revelation, but it can still be accompanied to a degree by Idealism, and this is what I alluded to earlier about how many commentaries blend Idealism with other perspectives, and it can even be accompanied to a degree by Futurism, because things that were literally fulfilled early in church history may have echoes that are still in our future, which is how I said I'd partially rehabilitate Futurism. One thus might reasonably argue, as Robert Mounce does in his commentary on Revelation,
"In John's vision, the beast is the Roman Empire, Preterism. It is that concentration of secular power which claims a religious sanction for its cruelty and injustice. Yet the beast is more than the Roman Empire. In a larger sense, it is the spirit of godless totalitarianism that has energized every authoritarian system devised by man throughout history, Idealism. At the end of time, the beast will appear in its most malicious form. It will be the ultimate expression of deified secular authority, Futurism."
So I'd call what we've put on the S tier as Preterism plus. Preterism is the literal sense of revelation, but it can be accompanied by echoes that occur in other parts of church history, as with Idealism, and even just before the end of the world, as with Futurism.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line?
The Book of Revelation can be interpreted in several different ways, but we can rank these interpretations of how good they are. On F tier is Pantelism, because it completely implausibly claims that events like the Second Coming, the resurrection of the dead, and the final judgment have already happened, and because it's heretical. On D tier is Futurism in its pure form, because it must leap over thousands of years of church history in a way that the Book of Revelation does not suggest, even though Revelation explicitly says it concerns what will soon take place, and Futurism makes the book irrelevant to its original audience. On C tier is Historicism, because it stretches the meaning of the word soon, and because it keeps generating falsifiable maps of church history as history gets longer. On B tier is Idealism, because it also stretches the meaning of the word soon, though it does not keep generating falsifiable maps of church history. On A tier is Preterism, because it has the best evidence for it as the literal interpretation of Revelation. It allows soon to have its normal, natural meaning, so the main subject of the book does happen soon from the perspective of John and his audience. It allows there to still be events in our future that have not yet been fulfilled, and it has a plausible mechanism in the book to get from our past to our future via the millennium, or long period of time that occurs near the end of the book. Finally, in S tier is Preterism plus, which honors Preterism as the primary literal fulfillment of Revelation, while also allowing other fulfillments in other periods of church history, as in Idealism and Futurism, based on the spiritual sense of the text.
And what further resources do we have to offer to the listeners and viewers?
Today we'll have a link to Steve Gregg's book, Revelation for Views, which is a parallel commentary summary. He's got columns for Historicism, Idealism, Futurism, and Preterism, and in each column he goes through Revelation passage by passage, and in each column he summarizes, here's how people from this perspective take this passage.
Now we turn to our mysterious feedback brought to us by our feedback coordinator, Rob Leonardi, and this feedback's coming on our episode 397, How Many Souls Do Twins Have? And More Weird Questions. And the first feedback comes from Rob himself, who writes, there are 2 points I respectfully disagree with you upon and would like your response.
Okay.
First, with the question of the ensoulment of twins, while I agree there is no official church teaching, I would argue that a third option would be that it is precisely the ensoulment of a second soul that instantaneously causes the division of the zygote, rather than ensoulment happening post hoc.
Well, I would acknowledge that there are additional options that are possible. I mean, to mention just one additional possibility, if you're allowing yourself to introduce new elements, you could say, well, actually, all human beings are conceived with 4 souls, and 3 of them end up flaking off over time, so we end up being born with just 1. That would also be possible. Also, you could conceive of souls that might hypothetically split or recombine to deal with some of these situations. What I was trying to do was use a version of simplicity, or Occam's razor, to explore one of the set of simplest solutions that are in line with common Catholic assumptions and findings of biology. But I acknowledge that other solutions are possible. They don't contain logical contradictions, and so God could bring them about.
Okay, and the second of his questions is disputes regarding fasting. I agree with you about following the spirit of the law is the most important. However, I was taught that Canon 97 specifically states that someone only reaches their age of majority when they complete their 18th year. Then Canon 203, Section 2, teaches that a year is reached at the end of the last day of the same number. So someone does not complete their 18th year until midnight of the day after their birthday. Thus, Canon 1252 would technically mean that fasting is bound to someone who's 18 years and 1 day until and inclusive of their 60th birthday.
Okay, so you've definitely identified the most essential canons for sorting out this process. For people who may not be aware, since you don't quote it, Canon 1252 says that the law of fasting binds all those who have attained their majority until the beginning of their 60th year. So it stretches from when you attain your majority at the completion of your 18th year until the beginning of your 60th year. And the reckoning of time is a little complex, but people need to remember that your first year is before you turn 1 year old. So you're in your first year when you're 6 months old, and when you're 9 months old, and when you're 10 months old. Once you pass your first birthday, you're in your second year. And that plays a big role here. To give a summary, this is from the CLSA, or Canon Law Society of America, commentary on the code, and it's in its section on 1252. It says the age of majority begins at midnight at the end of one's 18th birthday. So as soon as you've passed your 18th birthday and midnight has happened, you're in your majority and you need to observe the law of fasting. It then says the beginning of the 60th year occurs at the midnight at the end of one's 59th birthday. So as soon as you've had your 59th birthday, you are at the beginning of your 60th year, because remember, your first year is before you turn 1. Your second year is as soon as you've turned 1. So here, you need to get to your 59th birthday, at which point you have begun your 60th year and no longer are required to fast. So I'm not required to fast anymore, although I still do every single day.
And our next feedback comes from Arnas Jasinskis on Spotify, who writes, your answer on contingency of human life made me wonder, could a model of waiting souls, where the same soul could be embodied in different circumstances, even in principle, be compatible with Catholic anthropology? Alex O'Connor recently raised the non-identity problem, which made me think of possible solutions. I know the Church rejects pre-existence of souls, so could you share your thoughts on Catholic solutions to the non-identity problem?
Well, so I've covered some of this in previous exchanges, either on Catholic Answers Live or in Mysterious World. The idea of waiting souls that God could assign here or there, depending on what happens, is something that would be rejected by many people today, because it's commonly held that God creates a soul at the moment of conception and puts it in, for fertilization, and it is thereby the life principle of the child. That is not something that the Church actually teaches, but it is a common and reasonable interpretation. And I've held it myself for many years. Having said that, upon digging into this, I discovered that the idea of pre-existence of souls has not actually been condemned. What was condemned by some local councils that did not, and this was centuries ago, and the teaching has not been repeated, so it's fallen into desuetude, and it only ever applied locally anyway. But what was condemned was the idea that our souls pre-exist and have been banished to earth because of misdeeds in the pre-existence. That's what was condemned. The idea that souls are created before conception, that actually wasn't condemned. Now, that's not a view that has attracted a lot of support in Christian history, but it's not condemned. So I would say that that if I were doing an analysis of the non-identity problem, that would be one of the possibilities that I would have to take into account in a philosophical or theological analysis. I should mention what the non-identity problem is, because it's something that not a lot of people are aware of. But basically, the idea is that morality regarding future generations is more complex than you might think, because you could argue, well, if you have a child right now, let's say we're talking to a teenage mother. If you have a child right now, that child's going to be born in poor circumstances. It's going to harm this child. You should wait until you're in better circumstances. And so if the person doesn't wait, then they're going to have a child right now. The child is going to be harmed by being born in these circumstances. Whereas if the person waits, then they'll be able to give birth to a child who's in much better circumstances, will have a better life, an easier life. But the problem is these two children are not going to be the same child. That's why it's called the problem of non-identity. They are not identical. If she has a child now, it's going to involve a different ovum, a different male germ cell. It's going to be one person. But if the mother waits in, let's say for 4 years till they're not a teenager anymore, it's going to be a different ovum. It's going to be a different male germ cell. It's going to be a different person. And so if you consider it from this point of view, well, okay, maybe if you had a child right now, they wouldn't have some of the advantages a future child would have, but at least they'd be here. And so if you think about it from the perspective of the child right now, they could easily say, hey, yeah, I recognize I don't have all the advantages that other child would have, but at least I'm here. I get to exist. I get to live. It may not be the best circumstances, but I'd rather exist and have the good things that I do than not exist and not have them all. So the morality of saying things like, well, you ought to wait or you ought to do this differently, it's more complex than what you would think. It's so complex, in fact, that, and actually I've talked about this, not with this language, because the philosopher who came up with it was not someone I read, but independently, I realized this a long time ago in thinking through these moral issues. Like it comes up, for example, in questions of, my wife and I might have I've had people communicate this, they'll say, well, like my wife and I might have a child with a birth defect. Should we have kids? And I've pointed out the church has never forbid people with genetic problems from having kids. And I think there's a good reason for that, because even if your child has a genetic problem, they'll still exist. And even if they die in the womb, they'll still exist. And they're in the hands of a merciful God. I would expect them to go to heaven. So it's better to exist and go to heaven than to not exist. And so I've been talking about these issues for a long time. But since you asked about Alex O'Connor, he's got a video on this. I would say that the issue is complicated enough. I can't really deal with it now. Maybe I can deal with it in an episode of the Jimmy Akin podcast or in a future Mysterious World. But I would say that a lot of the solutions that I've seen to various questions that get posed on this subject are simplistic, especially about how they conceive right and wrong, and suppose that if something is right, it must be done, and if something's wrong, it must not be done. I think that actually there are optimal and suboptimal possibilities in there where, like, okay, that maybe it's not the best option from one perspective, but it's still permissible. Or maybe this is a superior option, but it's not a mandatory option. So I think that the issues of how good an option is and whether it's forbidden or permitted or required need to be disentangled. And that's the real way to navigate through the problem of non-identity.
Hey, PCman999-99 on YouTube writes, technically, we are at the center of the universe, the center of the visible universe. When astronomers look through telescopes at the universe, the farthest galaxies and quasars are all at the same distance from Earth just because of the age of the universe and the speed of light. The edge of the universe might really be 20 billion light years distant on one side and 40 on another and 50 on some other side. But because the universe is about 13.8 billion years old, the farthest we can see is 13.8 billion light years. So it looks like we're at the center.
Well, I agree. It does look like we're at the center of this space. But because we can't see a definitive edge to the universe, we can't establish a definitive center. It's like if I'm in a darkened basketball court and I strike a match that illuminates the space around me for, say, 6 feet, I perceive myself at being at the center of the space illuminated by the match, but I have no clue if I'm at the center of the basketball court. I could be over near one wall and just not see it because it's a couple of feet beyond what my match will illuminate. So that's the situation we're in with the physical universe. Yeah, agreed. Looks like we're at the center of what we can see, but we can't see a definitive barrier anywhere, and so we can't determine the actual center of this space, only the perceived center of the space, or the center of the perceptual space.
All right. And that's all our feedback for this time. And now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about Revelation and the different theories we've covered, like Futurism, Idealism, and Preterism? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page. Send us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm. Send a tweet to @MYS_world. Visit the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/discord, or call our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work in this episode. Check it out by going to my YouTube page, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, be sure to do the YouTube things, like, comment, share, and especially subscribe, and call down divine judgment upon the bell notification so that you'll always get notified whenever I have a new video.
So, Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Well, next week we're going to be looking at a mystery of science, but it's a mystery that many people think will have something to do with the Battle of Armageddon. Over the centuries, people have noticed some strange phenomena in the natural world, and in the last years of the 19th century, all this came to a head, and people finally came up with a name for these phenomena. These discoveries also had a massive impact on society in the 20th century and the fighting of warfare. So next week, we'll be telling you some amazing stories about the discovery of radiation and radioactivity.
So, folks, be sure to share the podcast with your friends. Write a review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from to help us grow our community and reach more listeners. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, and more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. You'll find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/408. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit givemysterious.fm. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Tom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.